There we go. All right, good evening, folks. Let's go ahead and take our Bibles and turn over to Leviticus chapter 17. We're making our last major transition in the book of Leviticus. So Leviticus is kind of broken up into these four large chunks. The first 7 chapters are the sacrificial laws and all the details of the responsibilities of the people and the responsibilities of the priesthood and how all that interacts, outlining the sacrificial system, which is really the heart of Israel's worship. And then chapters 8 through 10 are the installation of the priesthood, and Aaron and his sons are anointed and cleansed and go through the rituals that God demands for them to become the priests of the people, and they successfully execute that role. And then there's the sin of Nadab and Abihu, and the importance, the seriousness of the sacrificial system and their responsibility in it is brought to light. And then chapters 11 through 16 are the laws of uncleanness. So all of those things that are largely ceremonial, the vast majority of those are very much focused on helping Israel understand, just from a day-to-day practical perspective, how embedded in their lives the law is. Everything they eat, everything that they touch, everything they interact with, how the law impacts their lives. And all of that has this overshadowing reality that because God is holy and they have a relationship with him, everything they do should be touched by that. And so all the laws of uncleanness that culminate in chapter 16 with the cleansing of the temple and the Day of Atonement, and this reminder, sometimes we think of the Day of Atonement and we get this idea that it's Israel like getting right before God. Well, they were supposed to do that every time they had sin in their lives. That's what the sin offerings and the sacrifices were for. The Day of Atonement is this kind of ceremonial cleansing once a year, just refreshing Israel, marking themselves out as God's people over and over and over again, and being made ceremonially right to stand before God as a nation. And that finally brings us to chapter 17, where we get into guidelines for practical holiness. And so following on 17 down through the end of chapter 27, Leviticus really shifts focus from all of the ceremony of the sacrificial system and the priesthood and day-to-day cleanliness and into what we would consider much more moral law. There's still some ceremonial aspects mixed in, but it becomes far more focused on the morality of the people and the reality of living out a holy and a right relationship with God in our day-to-day living. And so Leviticus chapter 17, we're going to jump into that, where he talks about the issue of blood. Leviticus 17, picking up in verse 1, and Scripture says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron, to his sons, and to all the children of Israel, and say to them, This is the thing which the Lord has commanded, saying, whatever a man of the house of Israel who kills an ox or a lamb or goat in the camp, or who kills it outside the camp and does not bring it to the door of the tabernacle of meeting, to offer an offering to the Lord before the tabernacle of the Lord, the guilt of bloodshed shall be imputed to that man. He has shed blood, and that man shall be cut off from among his people, to the end that the children of Israel may bring their sacrifices which they offer in the open field, that they may bring them to the Lord at the door of the tabernacle of meeting to the priest, and to offer them as peace offerings to the Lord. And the priest shall sprinkle blood on the altar of the Lord at the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and burn fat for a sweet aroma to the Lord. They shall no more offer their sacrifices to demons, after whom they have played the harlot. This shall be a statute forever for them throughout their generations. Also you shall say to them, Whatever man of the house of Israel or of the strangers who dwell among you who offers a burnt offering of sacrifice and does not bring it to the door of the tabernacle of meeting to offer it to the Lord, that man shall be cut off from among his people. And whatever man of the house of Israel or of the strangers who dwell among you who eats any blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood and will cut him off from among his people. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes an atonement for the soul. Therefore I said to the children of Israel, no one among you shall eat blood, nor any stranger who dwells among you eat blood. Whatever man of the children of Israel or of the strangers who dwell among you, who hurts or hunts and catches any animal or bird that may be eaten, he shall pour out its blood and cover it with dust, for it is the life of all flesh. Its blood sustains its life. Therefore I said to the children of Israel, you shall not eat of the blood of any flesh, for the life of all flesh is its blood. Whoever eats it shall be cut off. And every person who eats what died naturally or what was torn of beasts, whether he is a native of your own country or a stranger, he shall both wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until the evening. And then he shall be clean, but if he does not wash them or bathe his body, then he shall bear his guilt. So there's a couple of things mixed in here. At the core of this, he's drawing attention to this idea that this issue of the sanctity of the sacrifices and the sanctity of particularly the shedding of blood as the symbol of that sacrifice. And so we see a few pieces of this play out. The first one is this command down through verse 8, basically, where he says that nobody is to go out and kill an animal and butcher it out in the field without bringing that back to the door of the tabernacle at some point and offering sacrifice when they do that. And so every butcher shop, every farmer, if you're out hunting, whatever you do, ultimately every animal is supposed to then be brought back to the tabernacle and you are to offer a sacrifice with that. The issue here is one of giving the right honor and the right praise where it belongs. And so he has this little line in there where he says that they've been out sacrificing to demons in the field. And so we get this idea that they've picked up some of the culture of Egypt while they were there, and they had been engaging in the pagan practice of when they were hunting or when they butchered an animal or whatever it is, there would have been these cultural things that just would have been normal parts of the culture. Oh, yeah, and you pour a little bit of the blood out and you say a thanks to the gods or something, or you do this. And they've picked up these pagan rituals, and God is telling them that's no more. From now on, whenever you kill an animal, whenever you're getting even just this practical reality of getting meat for the table to provide for your families, is to be an act of honor and an act of worship to me. And so that all of those pagan rituals, all of the sacrificing in the fields, all of that is to be done away with. And every one of those sacrifices is to be brought back to the tabernacle to offer a right offering to me while you're there, and to set that apart, to have a complete break from that. There's some interesting terminology in here. Up until Exodus 34, this is my evening for, a couple of weeks ago we were talking about discharges, and that was everybody's great and wonderful discussion that we had. This evening is going to be another one of those evenings between this and then chapter 18, if you've looked ahead. He uses the terminology here that they have been playing the harlot out in the fields. And he's talking about a spiritual reality. It's interesting because up until Exodus 34, every time that word is used, he's talking about a literal harlot. He's talking about someone who actually is practicing prostitution. Starting with Exodus 34, he introduces this idea to Israel that you, as the people of Israel, are in a relationship with me as your God, and when you stray away from me, when you worship false gods, when you engage in idolatry, you're engaging in a damage to the relationship that should be viewed. It's similar to if a man goes out and he finds a harlot. And we understand that has a very visceral, very vivid reality to us. We understand exactly how much that cuts to the heart of that relationship, how damaging that is to that relationship. And so he introduces that word picture that he uses throughout Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, and then the prophets of Israel pick that theme up, and over and over and over again that comes up. Hosea's whole life is wrapped up in that reality of Israel playing the harlot. And so he keeps coming back to this, trying to get Israel to understand what a critical, what a damaging thing it is when we let idolatry creep into our life. And so that's the word picture he uses here. He's looking at Israel. He says, look, you've picked up all of these things that you think of as just little cultural habits. It's what the people do. When you're in Rome, you do as the Romans do. But instead, he says, those pagan rituals, those pagan practices that you've been engaged in, they're harlotry, they're idolatry, they're a stain upon your relationship with me. You can't be in right relationship with me and still hang on to the world's worship and the world's idea of what the right way to do things is. And so he gives them this very vivid picture. And then he goes on, verses 10 through 12, and he gets to the heart of the matter. There's this issue of sacrifice and worship, even in what they eat. And he says it gets very pointed here. He says, "And whatever a man of the house of Israel, the strangers who dwell among you, who eats any blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood and will cut him off from among his people." Wow. That's a very serious issue. And he gets right down to it. He says the issue here is the life of the flesh is in the blood. I've given it to you as a sacrifice on the altar. That's the way you make atonement, that you make covering for sin. That's the symbolism of you recognizing how serious your sin is and the need to deal with that with me. And so to make light of that in any way, to abuse that in any way, to make that a casual thing, something that you have with dinner, it is a stain upon that. It's an attack on the seriousness of sin. And this is the famous verse, verse 11 here is the famous verse that Hebrews talks about on a couple of occasions when he's dealing with this issue of sacrifices. But this is a theme that God has dealt with Israel on a number of occasions. The language here is very poignant. Immediately it draws to mind the words of, in Genesis, when we read about Cain and Abel. And so you remember Cain and Abel has their fight, and God warns Cain. He says, if you struggle against sin and you master it, you'll have freedom. But if you succumb to it, it will have mastery over you. And Cain, of course, succumbs to his sin, and he goes out and he kills his brother. And then God is so good at doing this, he shows up and starts asking questions. Hey, Cain, where's your brother? Not because God doesn't know, but because Cain needs to deal with this. Where's your brother? Cain, am I my brother's keeper? Every parent in the room has seen their child do that at some point. Chocolate all over the face. I don't know where the chocolate pudding went, Mom. God, I don't know where Abel went. What's God's response? His blood cries to me from the ground. The symbol of his life that you spilled speaks to me. The author of Hebrews latches onto that and says that there's one who comes whose blood speaks of better things than the blood of Abel. That he's got this idea embedded in that from the very beginning. As far back as Noah, God had told the people of Israel, his people, not to eat and drink the blood. That was a common practice among the pagan rituals and among the pagan idolatry. And so there's a piece of that is putting away all the paganism. But there's also a piece of that of making sacred that which is the symbol of their being made right with God, putting it on a high plateau and giving it the honor and the praise that it deserves. And so he makes this a very serious thing. If you engage in the eating of blood, you're to be cut off from the people. You're not allowed to make profane, to make common that which carries such an important weight in your relationship with God. And then he wraps up the chapter, verses 13 through 14. He talks about if you kill an animal out in the field and its blood is spilled, you're supposed to cover that over with the dust. You're not just supposed to leave it exposed. You're kind of giving some honor and some peace to that before you bring it back then to the tabernacle to offer your sacrifice. And then verses 15 and 16, he even wraps up the chapter and he says that just this idea of we're dealing with day-to-day, how do we interact with, how do we live out our faith. He's talking about this idea that they're not supposed to eat things that die of natural causes or that are torn out, and that, our equivalent to this would be roadkill, This not anybody's, but you think about that. For the poor among them, that would have been a common source of meat. You didn't have a large flock. You didn't have a large herd. But you find some animal that's already dead out in the woods, you cook it and season it well, and it's meat that you didn't otherwise have. And so God is setting up for them this standard that you're going to trust in me, you're going to obey me, you're going to walk in light of our relationship together, even when it's not easy. And so for the poor who wouldn't have had many chances at meat, the idea that they're going to say, look, I'm going to honor God in that, and I think that just got struck by lightning, but I'm going to walk by and leave that and trust that God's still going to provide, that's a big step of faith. That's a big call to the rest of the children of Israel to provide for and to meet the needs of the widows and the fatherless and not leave them in a position where they have to rely on that. It's a big statement to the nation of Israel that when they're obedient to him, he's going to provide so abundantly that that won't be necessary. And it won't be something that they have to depend upon. And so all of that kind of wrapped up into this discussion about what they're allowed to eat and the sanctity of blood. And over and over and over again, as we've seen in the law, he's pointing back at the need for their relationship with him to override day-to-day concerns, to be something that's just has its fingers in absolutely everything that they think and say and do and how they interact with one another. All right, on to chapter 18. This is one of those chapters that you don't often go looking for a chapter like this, but it's here, it's in the text, it's important, there's some great lessons we can learn from it, and so we're going to try to deal with it in a way that honors the Lord this evening. So Leviticus 18, start off in verses 1 through 5. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. According to the doings of the land of Egypt where you dwelt, you shall not do. And according to the doings of the land of Canaan where I am bringing you, you shall not do, nor shall you walk in their ordinances. You shall observe my judgments and keep my ordinances to walk in them. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, with it, which if a man does, he shall live by them. I am the Lord." Leviticus 18 is about to deal with the proper behavior of the people of God as it regards their sexuality. Sometimes in our minds, I think we mistakenly blur the lines between that which is immoral and that which is merely private. We let that which is pagan and immoral somehow discolor and make dirty that which should not be dirty. God's clear that he created us, men and women, to desire each other and to, within the boundaries of biblical marriage, enjoy the sexual aspect of our relationship and of that character that he's created in us. That's why the author of Hebrews, when he talks about this, he says that the marriage bed is undefiled and holy in all. There's nothing immoral or wrong about that. That's part of his plan for marriage. But it is meant to be private between a husband and a wife. That's something that's part of your relationship that the guys that I work with have heard me say this on more than one occasion. When we're dealing, we interact with people in the world who have all kinds of things. And my general statement is, I really don't want to know. And not because of whatever your personal thing is. Like, I don't want to know about anybody's thing. I don't want to know what you do in your bedroom with your wife. I don't want to know what anybody else does. Like, I don't want to know. That's none of my business. I have no place knowing that. It's not productive. It's not helpful. That's supposed to be a private part of your relationship that God makes very special between a husband and a wife. That doesn't make anything wrong or dirty or inappropriate about it, but it's not public. That's a very different thing from many of the things that we're going to have to discuss this evening. We are going to discuss this evening in Leviticus chapter 18 that are things that are perversions of God's created plan and purpose. There are immoral, dirty things. There are things that are an attack upon God's plan for what's good and right and beautiful the way he's created it. And we want to not mix those two things up. We want to not let those things that are corrupt somehow taint those things that are good and right and pure. And so we want to go into it understanding that. Also, I want to say when we come to a passage like this, I made the comment before the power came on, I said, well, this would be the evening when I might have to make a last-minute change of plans, something I'm not want to do. Usually I take the stance that, well, this is the passage we're in, and God knew it was going to happen ahead of time, so we're just going to, we'll go to the next passage. That's what we do. But if we ended up consolidating the group a little bit tonight because the power was still out, I might have made a last-minute change of plans rather than deal with some of these things with some of the younger kids in with us, because it wouldn't be appropriate for them. They're not ready for some of that. They don't need to know about some of this. There is that reality of what's appropriate. But I think we need to be careful and understand when we're dealing with the text of Scripture, we don't want to be shy about saying what God says. We don't want to draw back and speak in euphemisms and kind of hide from the realities he says. Now, that doesn't mean we want to get into the lurid details, and we don't want to put in some kind of exhibition where we're being risky and pushing the limits on things just for the sensation factor. But we certainly don't want to draw back and be unclear where God is clear. And so we're going to get into the middle of all of this in just a moment here. But as we start off chapter 18, I think it's important to note how God starts off chapter 18. Over and over and over again in these 5 verses, he says, because I am the Lord your God. You're not going to do what the people in the land of Egypt did, because I'm the Lord your God. When you get to the land of Canaan, you're not going to do what the Canaanites do, because I'm the Lord your God. When you walk in my statutes and my ordinances to obey them, you're going to do that because I'm the Lord your God. Over and over and over again, this area of your life is going to play out this way because that's the way I designed it, because that's my plan for what's best for you. And any deviation from that, any failure in that area, any corruption of that is actually an attack on God first and foremost. And so he sets this standard for Israel to understand this isn't God meddling in private areas of your life that he has no business in. This is God telling them that your relationship with me should have an impact on even the most intimate moments and details of your life. That's not I was about to say that's not something that's terribly popular in our modern world. That's not something that's terribly been popular ever in history. Everybody, we have a very human nature to want to say, well, God, this, you tell us what to do on Sunday, but this is my thing. And God says, no, that's not how this works. All of your things are my thing. I created you this way. I designed you this way. I'm the one who gets to define what's right and wrong, and I set the standard. All right. With all of that behind us, on to Leviticus chapter 18, picking up in verse 6. Actually, verses 6 through 18 are all one big chunk. It's the first piece of this. And the Lord says, none of you shall approach anyone who is near kin to him to uncover his nakedness. We're going to say that word more times tonight than we will for months and months and months in church. To uncover his nakedness, I am the Lord. The nakedness of your father or the nakedness of your mother you shall not uncover. She is your mother, you shall not uncover her nakedness. The nakedness of your father's wife you shall not uncover. It is your father's nakedness. The nakedness of your sister, the daughter of your father, or the daughter of your mother, who, whether born at home or elsewhere, their nakedness you shall not uncover. The nakedness of your son's daughter or your daughter's daughter, their nakedness you shall not uncover, for theirs is your own nakedness. And the nakedness of your father's wife's daughter, begotten by your father, she is your sister, you shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's sister. She is near kin to your father. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister, for she is near kin to your mother. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother. You shall not approach his wife. She is your aunt. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your daughter-in-law. She is your son's wife. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife. It is your brother's nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of a woman and her daughter, nor shall you take her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter to uncover her nakedness. They are near kin to her. It is wickedness. Nor shall you take a woman as a rival to her sister to uncover her nakedness while the other is alive. A few of those are very on the nose for the nation of Israel. Jacob and then Judah and Tamar immediately come to mind. You can't avoid it. They're right there. Verses 6 through 18 outline God's prohibition on marrying close relatives, what we would commonly call incest in our modern culture, including those, note, that are close relatives through marriage and not just by blood. So there's a couple of points to be made here. Today, we generally look at these kinds of relationships and find them to be at the very least distasteful, if not outright grotesque. Generally, we have a very strong social stigma against these kinds of relationships in our modern culture. That was not the case in Israel's time. It was not the case in the pagan cultures around them, and historically, it had not been the case for any culture up until that point. We got to remember, you go back far enough, Adam and Eve's children married other ones of Adam and Eve's children. They wouldn't have had any choice. There weren't any other people. For generations, anyone who got married would have been marrying a relatively close family member. Second or third cousins would have been about the furthest you could have gotten for several generations down through history. We find the history of Genesis is replete with this. Abraham marries his sister, or his half-sister, and gets himself into big trouble over that on a couple of occasions. Isaac marries a first cousin, gets himself into big trouble over that on a couple of occasions. Jacob marries two sisters. You can make it, gets himself into massive trouble over that. You can make an argument he was sort of tricked into that, but he goes along with it and marries Rachel afterwards. He certainly had a choice in that matter. And so this was very common. We see this even up relatively close to the modern age. You're talking into the mid-1800s, at least, European royal families very commonly married very close relatives, sometimes even brothers and sisters, in order to keep the royal bloodline pure. There's a whole debate to be had about all of the chaos that caused and how pure some of those bloodlines really were. Yeah. Correct. Yeah, that very late 1800s for sure, even into the 1900s. It's a habit that just starts to fade out in very recent memory. That's a habit that has just started to fade out in certain parts of the culture. And so we tend to read this text and say, well, that's like, who is even doing that? And the answer is almost everybody. This is a new prohibition. God has not given this instruction to Israel before. Nobody's been commanded not to do this before. And so this is a new law. That's the reason why there's so much laid out about it. Because God, what are you talking about? And so instead of having this endless series of, well, what about this situation? What about this situation? God gets very detailed and says, you're not going to do this, and 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 you're not going to do this. Because you're going to honor me in your relationships. They would not have understood the rationality for this either. So relatively early on, before the corruption of sin sets in and the genetic corruptions start to build up, there would have been fairly little practical downside to marrying close relatives. There's not a lot of genetic corruption to bring about birth defects and all the problems that we think of today. The further you get from Genesis 1, the more that adds up. And we get to a point where today, the common secular rationality for not allowing this kind of behavior is that within just a generation or two, you get serious birth defects. This is a big, if you are in and around the Amish community, this is a really big problem. They don't allow what we would classify as technical incest, but it's still a very tight-knit community. And so just 2 or 3 generations back, almost everyone is related to each other. And they have a lot of problems with genetic defects in the community because they keep that genetic pool so small and so closely held together. And so the world looks at that and says, well, of course you wouldn't want that. And so very early on here, God sets that standard long before anybody else had figured out why there might be a problem there. And he begins to protect his people now that the pool of genetics is big enough to allow for it. And before it becomes a problem, he begins to protect his people. And he sets the standard for them to honor him. They don't know why. Everybody else thinks it's okay. But he says, you're not going to do that anymore because you're going to honor me in that. And so we look at some of these things and we think we know the reason, or we have a rationale for what the reason is. But ultimately, the reason comes down to because God says so. You're going to honor me in this. I've created you in a specific way. I have a designed plan for your sexuality within the bounds of marriage, and any deviation from that is an attack on my character and on my good planning for that. Tim?
We often think about and talk about the fact that in Christianity, there's a relationship with God through Jesus. But we see it here too.
Yeah.
How many times already have we read, because I am the Lord your God?
Yeah.
There is a relationship in the Old Testament, which sometimes is overlooked in the fact that, they're under the law and this and that. But the relationship is still key even then.
There's a relationship they're called to. They didn't often see it that way. And as we find out when we particularly, I would say, Malachi forwards, God starts making it super clear that Israel has become formalistic in their worship. We see that all over the place in the Gospels. And they've abandoned that idea that they have a true relationship with God, and it's all become ritual. And it's all become, there's that great passage, I'm going to misquote it, where Christ talks about that you're obeying your law in the little things while you're tripping over the big things. Like God's called you to have a right relationship with him, and you're worried about how much of the cumin for your dinner you've tithed. Just a total miss of the purpose of the Old Testament law. But yeah, all of this is bound up in this reality because you're my people, because you have a relationship with me. All of this law should be seen, can and absolutely should be seen as the expansion of the Ten Commandments. And all of that comes back when Christ is asked the question, what's the most important law? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your mind and with all your soul. And the second is like unto it, that you love your neighbor as yourself. All of it comes back to, do I have a good relationship with God? If I do, I'm going to honor him in all these areas of life. It's going to have a practical aspect in which it plays out, and that just floods out into all of these things. And so as God's laying out the law for the nation of Israel, some of this is practical, some of this is, it's ceremonial, some of it's civil law, how do you deal with criminals and day-to-day stuff. But at its core, all of it comes back to that reality. If I'm God's and I have a right relationship with him, that should have an impact on how I live. And if it doesn't, that's a testimony that I don't really see myself as God's, and my relationship with him is not real. That's one of the key distinctives of Christianity. You look at every other religion in the world, and it says, do these things to make God happy with you. Christianity says you can't do anything to make God happy with you. But once you have a relationship with God by his grace, you'll want to do the things that please him because of that relationship. The world looks at that and says, oh, that's just a timing issue. You're just saying you're going to do your good things later instead of your good things first. No, it's fundamentally different. It's wildly different. We're saying we don't do good things to please God because we can't. We're saying we want to do good things. We want to serve him. We want to honor him. We want to live a life that reflects him because we have a relationship with him and we love him. And we see that play out in our lives. And so Israel is given this standard. All right. Continue on. Verses 19 through 23, he lays out 5 sexual sins that are prohibited in addition for the nation of Israel. These fall into a slightly different category in that Israel would have understood that these were not socially acceptable, although they were still very common in their day. Leviticus 18, starting verse 19, says, also you shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness as long as she is in her customary impurity. Moreover, you shall not lie carnally with your neighbor's wife to defile yourself with her. And you shall not let any of your descendants pass through the fire to Molech, nor shall you profane the name of the Lord your God. name of your God, I am the Lord. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. Nor shall you mate with any animal to defile yourself with it, nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It is perversion. These handful of verses here, verses 19 through 23, contain the portion of this chapter which gets quoted the most. It lists 5 sexual sins that were prohibited by God, which needed less clarification. All 5 of these would have been seen as unseemly or distasteful to some degree, unlike incest, which was considered very common to them. And therefore, they needed less definition. But all 5 are acts of rebellion against God's plan for creation, and represent an attack on his plan for the family. And so, yeah. The descendants passing through the fire. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Give me a moment. We'll get there, Vonnie. I've got time. I'll get there tonight. I promise. No, you're okay. I don't want to get on a discussion about that because we're going to get there in just one moment, okay? All right, so he lists all of these. The first one, verse 19, is the command to abstain from intimacy even within the marriage relationship during a woman's time of the month. So this one is tied very closely, if we remember back a couple of chapters, to her ceremonial uncleanness during that time of the month. And so for the nation of Israel, this is a matter of ceremonial cleanliness. It's a matter, going back just to chapter 17, of giving the honor and the respect to that symbol of their sanctification with God of the blood. And so it's a matter of obedience. This one, I would argue, is less a matter of morality, strictly speaking, than it is a matter of God giving a standard for the nation of Israel to honor and giving them a reminder that even in their most intimate relationships, they're to honor him. You know, this one is somewhat unique compared to the others, and that all of the others deal with a sexual sin that involves damaging the marriage covenant somehow. This one doesn't necessarily do that. And yet, even in that, God wants Israel to honor and respect him, and he's giving them this command. I've said this a bunch of times as we've been through here. I'll say it a bunch more, however long we're in this study. The law touches absolutely every aspect of life. Like, it's constant. And it touches everything. It's what you eat, it's what you wear, it's what you plant, it's how you treat your animals, it's what you do on Saturday, it's your most intimate relationship with your wife, it's how you raise your kids, it's everything. There is no aspect of life that the law leaves untouched. And on the one hand, we can take the Israel perspective and we can look at that and say, wow, that's a huge checklist, and like, now I got to live my life checking things off on the checklist. That's not the point. God was not giving in Israel a checklist and saying, hey, if you can check all of these boxes, you'll be right with me. The point was, a right relationship with me impacts every aspect of your life. And it was to bring Israel to the point where they recognized, I can't do that. There is no moment in your life that the law didn't touch. There was no moment in your life where you could go, oh, okay, I'm okay. I don't have any law to obey for a moment. It was everywhere. And it was supposed to bring us, as Paul says in Galatians, to that point where we recognize it as a schoolmaster saying, you can't keep the law. Which brings then the inevitable next question. So what are we supposed to do if we can't keep the law? It was supposed to prepare them in their hearts and minds for their Savior. Israel, of